makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
As most of you know, I am an economist with a degree in everything, with professional experience in everything. But I have to confess, I absolutely hate my profession. Or rather, I hate a lot of the people who are representatives of my profession. And that is because there is no other profession, I think, in the world that has more impact on our daily lives than economics. And yet, the people who are the most representatives in the academic community, to say nothing of the policymaking community, really just can't think outside the box. They can't think outside of, basic uh, neoclassic toolbox that is like just a textbook view of how economies work. And I get the impression that, we are in the business of creating models of how the world works. But I think a lot of economists rather want to rearrange the world to fit the models. And that's my big beef with, free market fundamentalists, neoliberals, etc. They want the world to fit the models rather than the models to fit the world. Now, nothing has made this problem worse than a situation in which economists have been caught broadly unprepared for from a theoretical perspective as well as a policy making perspective. And that's the inflation surge that we've seen over the past year. Um, most inflation surges throughout history, at least in recent history, have gone largely unexplained at the time. When the 1970s had, the whole stagflation phenomenon, it didn't fit into the models at the time. And this spike in inflation also seems to just not fit with at least the way that we can resolve this crisis, if you can call it a crisis. I really don't think it's like that big a deal in the long term, but um, the way to resolve it just doesn't seem obvious by the standard policy prescriptions. We are in a situation, for example, in which monetary policy is usually the tool in which most governments fight inflation. But we're in a situation after a massive recession caused by the pandemic, which means that economies are still pretty weak. Recoveries are still very fragile. So logically, the inflation hawks are not going to raise interest rates the way that you normally would. Inflation usually is caused by economies overheating. That is, they're doing particularly well. So the standard policy prescription is for a central bank to raise interest rates. By raising interest rates, you create an incentive for saving rather than consuming, which thus cools the economy and inflation goes down. That is the standard policy prescription of an inflation spike. Now, the problem here is, of course, we have been living now since the global financial crisis in a situation of very low interest rates, near zero, which in theory would mean that you would have quite a margin to raise rates. But again, because we are just past a major recession, no one really wants to put the brakes on the economic recovery. So now we need to understand what is causing inflation right now, and therefore what the prescription is. So the standard argument that you will hear is that inflation is being caused by the global supply chain crisis. Now, there is a lot of truth to this. One of the culprits is China, because China currently has a zero COVID policy, which makes it rather difficult to run their economy and run their giant export machine as smoothly as would have been possible if such policy did not exist. So that is, the origin of the problem is there. Then it gets worse once you receive those goods in the country, in the destination country, because those countries also have their own litany of problems. In the US, for example, there is a shortage of truck drivers. There are probably shortage of warehouse workers, etc. The US is going through the great resignation, and a lot of people are quitting poorly paid or jobs or jobs that don't have much security. And, it's perfectly understandable why. So you have shortages in the US, which over the next couple of weeks and months are going to be made worse because of Omicron, because you're going to have staff shortages from all these people getting sick. So all of this is going to affect the logistics, is already affecting the logistics sector quite substantially. So that's the standard argument, right? But here's the kicker. During most inflation spikes, they have been driven. Well, when you hear inflation is at 7%, your natural instinct is to think, oh, in general, prices are rising by 7%. That means everything I'm buying is, give or take, 7% more expensive than a year earlier. But that's not actually the case. In fact, it's usually just a very small number of goods and services that are significantly increasing their price, like well beyond 7%. And so on aggregate, when you add every sector of the economy, when you're tabulating your inflation number, a small number of sectors or a small number of items are the ones that are causing that inflation spike. Now, don't take my word for it. Take the Economist's word for it. This was an article that they published a couple of months ago, where it shows that a handful of items are driving inflation in America. That's not the only report on this. Like I said, the range of items that their prices have gone up significantly is actually quite small. It's just a few items that have seen their prices rise. So what could be a standard policy prescription if you know for a fact that it's only a small number of items that are seeing inflation? Well, price controls. Now, when most economists hear price controls, they immediately think, oh my God, communism. We're in East Germany now. That is really just, again, proof that these people cannot get their heads outside of a standard textbook set of policy prescriptions. And there's a few economists who thankfully think outside the box. Here was an article published by a German economist, Isabella Weber. She recently wrote a book that looks very good. I've seen very good reviews about it, about China's economic modernization, that I really look forward to reading it at some point this year. So she wrote an article which seems to have a very sensible prescription. Could strategic price controls help fight inflation? Now, the word strategic here is important. It means that these price controls are only going to be applied to those particular goods that we know are disproportionately causing inflation. Now, we also know that these price controls would be temporary until the underlying factors that are driving these increases in prices could be sorted out. This seems to be a rather sensible proposal, or at least one that deserves discussion, even if you don't immediately agree with it. But a certain Nobel Prize winning economist that seems to be a hero in the American liberal centrist community disagreed. Paul Krugman tweeted, "I'm not a free market zealot, but this is truly stupid." Now, I'm sharing an image of this tweet because he ended up deleting it. A couple of days later, he confessed, deleting with extreme apologies my tweet about Isabella Weber on price controls. No excuses, it's always wrong to use that tone against anyone arguing in good faith, no matter how much you disagree. Okay, so, kudos for at least apologizing, even though some of his simps clearly don't agree that anyone should apologize for anything. But here's the problem with Krugman's point. So he has to start this with a disclaimer saying that I'm not a free market zealot. And that is because in the range of public opinion among leading economists, Paul Krugman is seen as a leftist in the US. If you're a New York Times, Washington Post reading liberal centrist, Paul Krugman is kind of your hero. He's a leftist in your view. These are people who think they are like center left. But the fact is, the range of public opinion on economics in the US is very narrow. So if Paul Krugman is seen as a non-free market zealot, that's only because he's being compared to like senior fellows from the Cato Institute or the American Enterprise Institute or the Heritage Foundation and all these other libertarian clowns from George Mason University or from the neoliberal bastion of the University of Chicago. So by those standards, Paul Krugman may seem like not a free market zealot, but someone who off the top of his head just automatically discounts the idea that strategic price controls could work as a stupid idea really tells you that even someone who is seen as a center or center-left voice in the US is really actually quite right-wing. Okay? So let's look at, that's one opinion from one economist, but let's look at a survey that was done by the Chicago Booth School. And this was really good. I only saw this a couple of days ago, and it's fascinating. So they did a survey. They do surveys apparently to leading academic economists. And they posed a couple of questions. So let's read the questions. Question A, a significant factor behind today's higher US inflation is dominant corporations in uncompetitive markets taking advantage of their market power to raise prices in order to increase their profit margins. Now, I said that the standard explanation of inflation is the supply chain crisis. But there's an addendum to this, and that is market concentration. There is a view among a lot of people, clearly not the established academic economist community, that because the US economy has gotten so concentrated, so many firms now have monopoly or oligopoly power, that they are driving at least partly this inflation spike. In other words, if we were operating in a much more competitive economy, this would not be happening, at least to that scale. Now, I am of the view that obviously we need, this inflation spike is still relatively recent. We need more evidence to definitively conclude this. However, I do think that it is, purely by what we know about the state of the concentration of the US economy, that this could be a important factor. So just how concentrating the US economy is, well, again, I'm going to quote The Economist on this. This is a chart that they published a couple of years ago on the top 4 firms of each industry, whether their share of the total revenues of that industry. And the firms on the upper half of this chart, above the line, are those who have become more concentrated in the years between 1997 and either 2007 or 2012, depending on what the data is. And as you can see, the grand majority of industries in the US have gotten more concentrated. Now, I also wrote about this in my book, which I hope if you're a subscriber to my channel, you have bought. If not, I'm going to link it in the description, but I do have a section where I discuss this. And I also made a chart. This is taken from the book. It's a bit easier to read than the Economist chart, but it basically says the same thing. These are the major industries that are being, this is the US's business census, which I think comes out every 5 years or so. But yeah, you can see that the grand majority of industries, information technology is the most concentrated, unsurprisingly. But transportation, which has a huge impact also on the prices of goods, because they're the ones that are actually distributing everything, has also gotten incredibly concentrated. And yeah, there's only a few industries that have arts and recreation, healthcare, surprisingly. Other services, professional services have seen some improvements there, but the grand majority of industries in the US have gotten more concentrated. Now, how does this impact inflation? Well, if you have a perfect, assume the most competitive economy you can imagine, and because of the logistical problems that I've already explained, China's near zero COVID policy, the staff shortages, whatever, you are facing an increase in the cost of your inputs from abroad. So if you are in a competitive economy, in a competitive market where you have many other rivals that are looking to undercut you, you will be tempted to pass on those costs as little as possible to your consumer. You will want to raise prices as little as possible because you know the other guy is going to undercut you. On the other hand, if you're a monopolist or an oligopolist or a cartel, that really is, we don't use the word cartel enough outside the context of Mexican drugs cartels. But the idea of a cartel is that you have a group of companies in a certain industries who are very comfortable and don't compete. And this is, it's often very hard to bust a cartel because you can't prove that it actually exists. You can't prove that, they're meeting in smoky rooms, conspiring to not raise prices. But in fact they don't need to. You just can be in a situation where you're highly profitable by not competing and then decide, hey, we don't need to compete. So if you're in a situation of a monopoly, oligopoly, cartel, whatever you want to call it, whatever industrial organization you want to describe that is not competitive, what's your first instinct when you face an increase in the cost of your inputs? Well, you're going to pass it on to the consumer. So this is very simple. I'm not deviating from standard, any course on industrial organization that you take in economics. I'm not deviating from the standard views that you will see in this. I'm not deviating from the model. So why is this so fucking hard for so many economists to understand that this might be a driver? If you know that this is true, you know that the US economy is increasingly more concentrated. In fact, here's another nugget of wisdom that I quote in my book. Did you know that that only 1/3 of inequality in the US is caused by intra-firm inequality? That is, massive CEO pay, etc. That is only the cause of 1/3 of total inequality, of the rise in inequality. The other 2/3 are from inequality between firms, because markets in the US have gotten so concentrated that you have a few firms that can pay their workers way more than all the other firms that end up being suppliers to those big firms. So yeah, this is a massive, massive, massive problem. And so to assume that there are no consequences from this concentration of markets in the US into the prices that you are seeing on store shelves is absolutely naive. So let's see what all these economists answered to this question. And there's three other questions. The question B is, antitrust interventions could successfully reduce US inflation over the next 12 months. So I definitely think that this is needed. Antitrust has basically been put on the back burner for, during the entire neoliberal era. There is evidence that antitrust legislation during the Roosevelt administration was also one of the causes of why the economy ended up recovering significantly. And the period when you did have antitrust legislation being applied, up until the 1970s ish, was a period when the U.S. economy grew particularly strongly, and incomes were rising at the pace of productivity, something that doesn't happen now. My main issue with this question is the over the next 12 months. I don't know if this would be quick enough to solve the problem, but on the whole, I do think that antitrust, on the whole, would lower prices, from a structural level into the medium and long run, even if there's not that much impact within the next 12 months. But you can see, like, the aggregate responses from the first question, over half of them disagreed, just outright disagreed. The ones who, if you add the strongly disagreed, then it's definitely a majority, like a strong majority. Only 2% strongly agreed with this idea that monopoly, concentration of markets is a driver of inflation, and only 5 just basically agreed. And in this one, again, strong levels of disagreement and very strong levels of strong disagreement as well. So 75%, fully 3/4 of economists who were polled did not think that antitrust would have any impact on inflation. Just imagine that. And finally, price controls as deployed in the 1970s could successfully reduce US inflation over the next 12 months. Again, a majority disagreed, although there was more agreement. And again, this is the idea that strategic price controls could work, even if in the 70s, you know, they weren't that tremendously successful. But let's look at who answered and how they. Now, I don't know all of these, but there are a few that I am familiar with and not surprised by their response. So Darren Asimoglu, he's a very well-known development economist. You would think that being a development economist, he would sort of lean left-ish on this issue, but he's uncertain. U.S. has a big business problem with various pernicious effects, but it's not clear whether this has been a major factor in inflation. So I think this is like the baseline of like beyond this, you're fundamentally disagreeing with the premise. I think this is like a bit of a cop out, to be honest, but the minimum defensible response that you can give to this. Let's see who else. Abhijit Banerjee, recent Nobel Prize winner. He agreed. Now you'll see something here. The Nobel Prize winners that were polled in this survey, the majority did agree. So this is kind of interesting. So agreed, and with a relatively strong. So the number is the degree of confidence they have in their answer. Yeah, that's pretty. That's good response. Let's see the other guys. Angus Deaton, another Nobel Prize winner. He wrote a really good book, by the way. I forget what the name is, but it's his last book, if I recall correctly. But it's quite good. Also agreed, and with pretty strong 8. So yeah, good for him. Barry Eichengreen, he's an international economist. Writes a lot for like Project Syndicate and things like that, I believe. Disagreed. Okay. So this is also some of the response. Some of them added like a little snippet of, and this is hilarious. Like, dominance has increased dramatically in last 2 years. When you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. It is demand and supply. What the hell does that even mean? This is just it's amazing. Like, some of the replies are completely nonsensical. Austin Goolsby. Here's a fun fact. When I was doing my undergrad thesis, I saw a paper that he did that had a survey on technology adoption and diffusion, which was the theme of my thesis, that had a survey that was very close to the kind of survey that I wanted to make. So I emailed him and asked if he could send me a copy of the survey questionnaires, because in the paper you just had the responses, but I didn't have how the questions were framed. And he replied, and he didn't say like, hi, thanks for reading the paper, here's the survey, or just, hi, here's the survey, have a nice day. Nothing. He just sent the email, blank email, just completely, like, no words in it, just the survey questionnaires attached. So, at least he responded. At least I got what I wanted. But just really tells you just how like non-human some of these people are. Anyway, University of Chicago. I think he was an advisor during the Trump administration. So margins are up, but not by enough to explain inflation. So the profit margin argument is also a bit ridiculous. There's a lot of people that I've seen and have been arguing that a firm that doesn't have high profit margins cannot be abusing their market power. And that is also ridiculous. First of all, the number that you see when you see margins usually is net margins. So there could be other things that company is needlessly investing in rather than, actually expanding its investments in good ways or paying their workers more. Like, who was this? The guy who, I forget what his real name is, but his Twitter handle is No Opinion. He's that guy from Bloomberg, pretty well known. He was basically arguing on Twitter the other day that Kroger supermarkets who are on strike right now could not be were not bad because their profit margin was only 1.52%. Imagine that. Anyway, uh, it's unsurprising that almost everyone from the University of Chicago disagrees with this. But yeah, the proposition is an elementary confusion of levels and changes. Market power causes high prices, not rising prices. Okay. Again, a fundamental misunderstanding of, for example, how is Amazon not a monopoly if they sell things cheaper than anyone else? And the answer is Amazon is a monopoly in terms of the or rather Amazon is a monopoly because its primary source of revenue is not what they sell to you. It's their web services and it's what the services that they charge the people who sell through them, who then face much higher warehouse costs, for example, for having their goods in an Amazon warehouse. Because if you don't actually have your goods in an Amazon warehouse and pay the exorbitant Amazon warehouse prices, the algorithm will not promote your Amazon store as much as they should. So again, fundamental misunderstanding. And this is just basic. This is just basic. There's so much has been reported about all this that it can't be that you're in your friggin', little your Stanford University econ department office and just be completely oblivious to any of this. Just read, rehash theory, rehash the textbook. This is crazy. Who else? Stephen Kaplan, of course, Chicago Booth, strongly with a 9. Yeah, more Chicago. Yeah, it is crazy. I would love to have a debate with any of these people. I honestly think that a lot of economists really aren't that smart, like beyond their particular area of expertise. Like a lot of these probably don't know as much about inflation as they would think. Yeah, William Nordhaus, who hasn't read an economics textbook from Nordhaus. This one was slightly surprising. Emmanuel Saez has worked a lot with what's his name, Thomas Piketty. He disagreed, not with a strong confidence, but still, this was quite shocking. Market power yields high prices, not rapidly rising prices. Again, this is such a fundamental misunderstanding. The idea is that you are facing higher inputs. The rise in the inputs is what you can't control because you're getting these, from China, from whatever. But then you pass this on to the consumer rather than assume the cost. This isn't hard. Richard Thaler, the guy, the nudge guy, who I think is, this whole nudge thing was incredibly overrated. Behavioral economics as a whole was incredibly overrated. At the time, I think it was quite useful and quirky, but now it's just, it's basically how to get more desirable outcomes without challenging the system. That's my main issue with behavioral economics. Yeah, disagree. There was another Nobel Prize winner around here. Can't find it. I think there was like 3 or 4 of them. Anyway, the second question, again, like the second question, I think is the one that I would also be a bit more uncertain about. I wouldn't blame anyone from I definitely would not disagree with that premise, but my confidence would be quite low in the sense that in the space of 12 months, I would wonder if antitrust would have an impact. But sort of same replies. So Banerjee, yeah, I think this is like quite sensible to just be. I'm not gonna criticize those who were kind of on the fence on this one here. And yeah. Oh, so Holmstrom is the other Nobel Prize winner, and he's also mostly agreeing with the questions. So yeah, and question C, that was the price control ones. What again, so here's a good. So Darren Asimoglu agreed with the price control ones, slight degree of confidence. Again, I would definitely agree with this, but my degree of confidence would also be quite low. So if I answered this question, the first one I would probably strongly agree with a relatively high confidence. The second one I would probably like weakly agree with a low degree of confidence, and mostly it's because of that 12-month span that they're asking. And on question C, I would probably agree with it with a sort of moderate degree of confidence. The idea of price controls ventures into the terrain of how well the government is gonna, are they gonna set the right price controls on the right goods? Is it gonna be temporary, whatever? So a lot will determine, even if you think the idea of price controls is a good one, a lot will depend on how effective the government applies this policy. But yeah, so like I said, and the last one, there was more agreement, which I actually find a bit surprising because I would think that the oh, Goolsby, look at this one. Just stop. Seriously. Oh my God. Anyway, I don't know what else to say other than it's just really disappointing that these people can't think outside the box, can't think outside a standard textbook, and we are in difficult times. We are in unprecedented times. And I think the idea that all the answers are found in just the standard policy prescriptions that these people have been used to for the last 30 years or whatever is incredibly naive, incredibly naive. And I think we deserve better. We definitely deserve better than these people, and we also deserve a bit better than the pundits like Bloomberg's No Opinion, who are basically just rehashing these standard policy prescriptions. And some people are, thinking that these people have the final word. But yeah, anyway, I can guarantee you will get much better economic analysis on this channel than you will get on, reading the comments like Goolsby's "Just Stop, Seriously." Yeah. So on that note, if you like this video, please like, please share, most importantly, please subscribe to the channel. And if you want to read more about market concentration, there is a chapter in my book where I discuss some of this stuff. So buy the book. Link is in the description, and I will see you next time.